We completed the the first two chapters of Habakkuk, and that last one, chapter 2, was very difficult because it had to deal with the judgment of Babylon. And it's never pleasant to do teachings on things like that. And when I put it on YouTube, I edited a lot of it. I almost wanted to edit the whole thing. I don't like it. Chapter 3 of Habakkuk taught me something. It changed my whole attitude about when God resorts to very extreme judgments. And I never saw this until Habakkuk, chapter 3. In that whole chapter, the last chapter of Habakkuk is a song. It's a prayer that was meant to be sang with and played with string instruments, which is very interesting. I tried to see if I could find a Hebrew version of that song, and I could not find it. So it must have been an awesome song, the whole chapter. So that was my introduction. But the way it changed my thinking, remember I mentioned about this British gentleman that changed D.L. Moody's whole attitude of ministry? I think chapter 3 of Habakkuk kind of has changed my whole view of, in the Old Testament, when there is judgment, I looked at it only from one side, from the judgment part, the part that was missing from me, and I did not get to really grasp it until chapter 3 of Habakkuk, is that God, when he does something like that, is not doing it out of anger and wanting to punish. He's doing it because he's trying to save his people. I mean, really trying to save his people. It's the same way as if you have to cut a finger to save the hand. When people, God's creation, get to the point where they no longer are able to continue without being destroyed completely, God has to intervene. And when did that begin? It began in Genesis chapter 3, when the fall of man could not stay in the Garden of Eden in that condition of, they were dead spiritually at that point. They could not stay there. So God had to expel them from the garden for their own benefit, to save them, because he was going to bring about the Messiah through the seed of the woman. So it was an act of love when God took them out of the garden. It wasn't an act of anger and judgment as much as it was an act of love. When Noah built the ark, because God was going to destroy the earth, was not out of anger and out of trying to punish people, but he had to save the human race, because it got to the point where, if allowed to continue, it would destroy itself. We just do not see it, because we're looking at this thousands and thousands of years afterwards. When God delivered the people of the covenant people from Egypt, he had to do it because the covenant people had become idolatrous. They were losing their faith completely, and God had to remove them from Egypt, or the covenant people were going to be destroyed by the enemy. So it was an act of loving kindness that he took them through the desert for 40 years to remove the idolatry culture of Egypt out of his covenant people. And it took 40 years for this new generation. Now they possessed the land, and they built the temple in Jerusalem. They wanted kings, and the kings became extremely corrupt. And they were bringing the people through every cycle. They were going down and down and down and down, to the point where God had to intervene, or the covenant people were going to be completely destroyed. As the northern kingdom was already exiled, now the kingdom of Judah also had to be exiled. Not out of anger, but out of love. So he brought them to Babylon. And that's where we at the point that we find ourselves with Habakkuk in chapter 3. And Habakkuk sees it. He understands it. And that's, I'll cover next week. I'm hoping to go ahead and begin the third chapter of Habakkuk. And of course, if you want to fast forward, you know what happened. They came back. They built the second temple. They had this long period of time. They didn't have kings. They had princes, the rulers. But Jesus, the Messiah, was brought in out of an act of love and kindness, because the salvation of the humanity depended on him, not on those animals that were sacrificed. And you know the rest of the story. They rejected the Messiah. God had once again, he had to do something, and he had the second temple destroyed. Or the Romans destroyed the temple. The covenant people spread throughout the world for 2,000 years. And now he's begun, and then of course he allowed the Holocaust. That's hard for us to understand. Why in the world did God just stood by and allowed the Holocaust to take place in Europe? Believe it or not, that's another act of loving kindness of God to save his people. Because the people, the Jews of Europe, and I guess maybe in some other smaller degree throughout the world, had actually become very secular. And they were 2,000 years, they had not gotten any better. And so God had to do something, and he brought them to the land. So look at God's judgments, not so much as an act of anger and hatred and punishment, but his loving kindness toward. And by the way, the same thing it's going to happen to the Christians too. Because of his love, sometimes he allows tyrants and governments to oppress his people, as it is going today. Look at the Muslim countries and in India, how the people of God are persecuted and killed, and nobody cares. The U.S. government could care less about what happens to Christians here or abroad. So when we get to Habakkuk chapter 3, please understand the transformation that took place where the prophet finally understood that God is all about love, not hate, not anger. And that was the introduction that I wanted to give today.